At 9:42 on the morning of September 15th, 1944, Corporal Tommy Reeves crouched in the jagged white coral of the Umobrogold pocket, watching a Japanese officer kill his friends from half a mile away. The heat on Peleliu was already 115 degrees, a wet, suffocating blanket that made the air shimmer like boiling water. But Tommy did not feel the heat. He only felt the sharp edge of the coral digging into his knees and the heavy thud of mortar rounds walking up the valley floor. 400 yards ahead, the jungle had been stripped away by naval gunfire, leaving a moonscape of white rock and black ash. And standing on a limestone ridge exactly 800 yards to the north was the man responsible for the butchery. The Japanese officer stood in plain sight. He was not hiding. He was not crawling through the mud or pressing himself into a bunker. He stood tall, wearing an oppressed uniform that looked impossibly clean against the grey rock. He held a pair of binoculars in one hand and a map case in the other. To the exhausted, bleeding Marines of the 1st Division, this man looked like a ghost or a god. He would raise his hand, point to a cluster of rocks, and 10 seconds later, a Japanese mortar team hidden on the reverse slope would drop a shell right on top of a Marine fire team. He was conducting an orchestra of violence with absolute impunity. He knew exactly where the Americans were, and more importantly, he knew exactly what weapons they carried. The standard American infantry rifle in 1944 was the M1 Garand. It was a semi-automatic masterpiece, rugged and reliable, capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. But the Garand had a limit. Its effective range was 500 yards. Beyond that, the iron sights covered up the entire target, and the bullet began to tumble and drift. The Japanese officer was standing at 800 yards. He had done the math. He knew he was untouchable. Tommy turned his back on the ridge and dragged a long, heavy canvas case out from under a tarp. The case was covered in mold and wet sand, but the contents were pristine. He unbuckled the leather straps and pulled out a weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum, or perhaps a circus. It was a 1903 Springfield, a bolt-action relic from the First World War. But it wasn't the rifle that made the other men stop cleaning their wounds and stare. It was the scope mounted on top of it. The scope was an unearthly 8-power target optic. It was absolutely massive. The steel tube was 24 inches long, nearly the length of the rifle barrel itself. It sat high above the receiver on delicate aluminum mounts that looked like they were made from erector set pieces. It didn't look like a tool of war. It looked like a piece of laboratory equipment, a fragile glass pipe that would shatter if you sneezed on it. The men in the trench looked at the rifle, and then they looked at Tommy, and then they laughed. It was a dark, bitter laughter, the kind that comes from men who have seen too much death to believe in magic. Sergeant Frank Harding shook his head and spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the white rock. "You planning to study the stars, Reeves, or maybe hunt for butterflies?" He called the rifle a mail-order toy. He said that glass tube would fog up in 5 minutes in this humidity, or the first speck of grit would jam the sliding mechanism. He told Tommy to put the toy away and pick up a real rifle before he got himself killed. They had been fighting for weeks in caves and spider holes, engaging the enemy at ranges of 10 feet. The idea of a precision instrument in this grinder was offensive to them. Tommy ignored them. He knew what they saw. They saw a delicate, finicky instrument that had no business in the mud. They saw a liability. But Tommy saw something else. He saw the only weapon on the entire island capable of bridging the gap between the trench and that ridge. He set the rifle down on a stack of rotting sandbags and began his work with the focused calm of a watchmaker. He wiped a smudge of oil from the ocular lens with a dry cloth he kept in a waterproof pouch. He checked the mounts, tightening the thumb screws with painful precision. The scope was so long that he couldn't just rest the gun on a rock. The tube would hit the obstacle before the barrel did. Sergeant Harding watched him work, shaking his head. "The Jap officer will be gone by the time you finish playing with your science project. War isn't a math problem, kid." But Tommy knew that war was exactly a math problem. It was a problem of trajectories, velocities, and angles. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. It was water-stained and wrinkled, filled with pencil scratches and diagrams. He flipped to a page marked 800 yards and ran his finger down a column of numbers. Then he pulled out a stub of carpenter's pencil and wrote directly on his left forearm just below where his sleeve was rolled up. 800 yards, plus 28 clicks elevation, right 4 clicks windage. The Japanese officer was 800 yards away. The 30 caliber bullet from the Springfield would leave the muzzle traveling at 2,800 feet per second, but gravity was a constant, relentless force. Over that distance, the bullet would not fly in a straight line. It would drop. It would fall out of the sky like a stone thrown from a bridge. At 800 yards, the bullet would drop more than 100 inches. Tommy would have to aim nearly 9 feet above the officer's head to hit him in the chest. He would have to lob the round into the air and let gravity do the rest. Tommy lay down behind the rifle. He pulled the stock into his shoulder, feeling the familiar solid weight of the wood. He placed his cheek against the comb and looked through the glass. The world rushed toward him. The 8-power magnification cut through the distance, erasing the heat waves and the smoke. Suddenly, the Japanese officer wasn't a small blurry figure on a distant ridge. He was right there. Tommy could see the buttons on his tunic. He could see the sweat on his forehead. He could see the way his mouth moved as he shouted orders to his men. The mockery from the trench faded away. The laughter of the sergeant didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the crosshair floating in the glass tube. The officer on the ridge turned. He seemed to look directly down the valley, staring right at Tommy's position. He didn't see the Marine. He didn't see the rifle. He only saw a pile of rocks and dead trees. He smiled a confident, arrogant smirk that said he was the master of this battlefield. He raised his hand to signal another mortar volley. He was safe. He was untouchable. He was 800 yards away, and no American rifle could touch him. Tommy reached up and adjusted the elevation knob on the top of the scope. Click, click, click. The sound was crisp and mechanical, a tiny, precise noise in a world of chaotic explosions. He dialed in the range. He checked the wind, watching the way the smoke drifted across the valley floor. It was pushing left to right, maybe 5 miles an hour. He adjusted the windage knob. Click, click. The crosshair moved. Tommy took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, expanding his chest against the hard coral. He let half the breath out and held it. The chaos of battle collapsed into a single point of focus. The Japanese officer was still smiling. Tommy wrapped his finger around the trigger. But before he could fire, something else pulled at him. A memory sudden and vivid, cutting through the present like a knife through silk. He was 14 years old again, standing in the woods outside Hickory Corners, Michigan. The frost was still on the ground and his breath came out in white clouds. His father stood beside him, patient and quiet, holding the same model Springfield rifle Tommy now held, though that one had no scope, just iron sights and faith. "Math doesn't kill the deer, Tommy," his father had said, "but math tells you where to aim." Tommy had calculated everything that morning. 300 yards to the whitetail buck, 10-mile-per-hour crosswind from the west. He'd done the arithmetic in his head, factoring in the drop and the drift, and he'd whispered the answer to his father. "Hold 18 inches left, 8 feet high." His father had smiled, the kind of smile that said he was proud without having to speak the words. "Show me." Tommy had fired and the deer had dropped instantly. A perfect heart shot. They'd walked to it together through the frozen leaves, and his father had knelt beside the animal with a kind of reverence that Tommy didn't understand until years later. "You're not a natural shooter, son," his father had said, running his hand along the deer's flank. "You're something better. You're a calculator." That night, sitting by the fire in their small house on the edge of town, his father had pulled out his own rifle from the First World War and set it across his lap. "I killed Germans with this at 400 yards, he'd said, his voice quiet. "Iron sights, guesswork, I missed more than I hit." He'd looked at Tommy then, and there was something in his eyes that the boy didn't fully comprehend. A kind of weight, a kind of knowledge. Imagine what you could do with glass, Tommy. Imagine what you could do if you could see them before they saw you. Tommy had never forgotten that conversation, and when his father died on Guadalcanal in 1942, killed by a Japanese sniper he never saw, Tommy had made a promise standing over the closed casket at the funeral. He would finish what his father started. He would learn to use the glass. Now on Peleliu, with the scope pressed against his eye and the Japanese officer in his crosshair, Tommy whispered the same words his father had taught him. "Patience beats firepower." He exhaled the last of his breath. His finger tightened on the trigger. The trigger on the 1903 Springfield broke like a thin rod of glass. It was crisp, sudden, and terrifyingly light. There was no creep, no grit, just the immediate release of the firing pin spring. The rifle slammed back into Tommy's shoulder with a violence that surprised him every single time. It was a sharp, angry kick, far worse than the gas-operated shove of a Garand. But Tommy didn't feel the bruise forming on his collarbone. He was too busy watching the scope. This was the moment the infantrymen didn't understand. They thought a scope was just a magnifying glass glued to a gun. They didn't know about the slide. When the rifle fired, the recoil drove the wooden stock backward, but the heavy steel tube of the unearthed scope wanted to stay put. The laws of physics took over. The scope actually slid forward inside its aluminum rings, moving nearly 3 inches along the barrel. It looked like a piston on a steam engine. It was a bizarre, jarring mechanical action that looked like the gun was falling apart. If Tommy had been looking through a modern scope, the recoil would have smashed the eyepiece into his socket and blinded him. But the unearthed slid away from his face, absorbing the shock, keeping the delicate lenses safe from the brutal energy of the .30-06 cartridge. Tommy kept his eye glued to the rubber eyepiece. He manually reached up and pulled the scope back into battery, sliding it rearward until it clicked into its starting position. It was a muscle memory he had practiced 1,000 times. Shoot slide bolt. He didn't blink. He couldn't afford to blink. The bullet was still in the air. At a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, the round covered the first few hundred yards almost instantly, but as it flew, the air grabbed it. The drag slowed it down. Gravity pulled it toward the earth. The bullet took 1.4 seconds to cross the 800-yard valley. That might sound like a heartbeat, but in a gunfight, 1.4 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time to take a breath. It is enough time to doubt your math. It is enough time for the target to bend down, to tie his shoe and ruin everything. Tommy watched the ridge through the magnified circle of light. The Japanese officer was still smiling. He was mid-sentence, his hand raised to point at the marine lines. And then the physics equation solved itself. The officer simply collapsed. There was no dramatic flailing, no movie-style backward flip. It looked like someone had cut the strings on a marionette. The man just folded in on himself and dropped straight down behind the limestone lip of the ridge. The pink mist that the snipers talked about wasn't visible at this distance, not even with 8-power magnification. There was just the sudden jarring absence of the man who had been playing guard. The sound of the shot finally rolled back across the valley, a flat, heavy crack that echoed off the coral walls. Then silence. Absolute heavy silence. The Japanese mortar crew on the reverse slope waited for an order that never came. The machine gun to the left stopped firing, confused by the sudden disappearance of their commander. In the American trench, the Marines who had been mocking Tommy 10 minutes ago were frozen. They lowered their binoculars. They looked at the ridge. Then they looked at the toy rifle resting on the sandbags. Sergeant Harding stood up slowly, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the impossible distance, then back at the skinny kid with the glass pipe on his gun. The mockery evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a look of confusion that slowly hardened into something close to fear. Not fear of Tommy, but fear of what Tommy represented. The idea that war could be reduced to mathematics, that death could be calculated like a trigonometry problem. Tommy didn't celebrate. He didn't look up for acknowledgement. He reached for the bolt handle. This was the other drawback of the Springfield. It was slow. With the Garand, you just kept pulling the trigger. With this bolt action relic, you had to physically unlock the breech, drag the spent casing out, and shove a new round home. Tommy worked the action with the palm of his hand, a smooth, deliberate motion. The empty brass cartridge spun out of the chamber and pinged against the coral rock. He drove a fresh round into the chamber and locked the bolt down. He was ready again. Sergeant Harding moved across the trench, no longer laughing, no longer skeptical. He knelt beside Tommy, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was quieter, respectful. "How far was that, 800 yards?" Tommy said. He didn't look up from the scope. He was already scanning the ridge for the next target. "And you just calculated it?" "Yes, Sergeant." Harding stared at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes. He shook one loose and offered it to Tommy. This was significant. Harding shared his cigarettes with no one. Tommy took it, though he didn't smoke. It wasn't about the cigarette. It was about the gesture. "Kid, Harding said, lighting both cigarettes with a Zippo that had seen better days. "I was wrong about you." Tommy nodded. He took a single drag of the cigarette, coughed, and set it down on the sandbag. His eyes never left the scope. 3 minutes later, a Japanese NCO crawled up to the ridge to check on the officer. He was careful. He stayed low, keeping his head down, but he made a mistake. He stopped to look through the officer's binoculars. He exposed his head and shoulders for 5 seconds. Tommy was already waiting. He had pre-aimed at the exact spot where the officer had fallen. The crosshair was hovering over the white limestone. When the helmet appeared, Tommy didn't have to calculate anything. He just squeezed the glass rod trigger. The second shot cracked through the humid air. The recoil slide kicked back. The scope reset. The NCO didn't even hear the sound that killed him. The heavy .30 caliber bullet punched through his helmet and knocked him backward off the ridge. 2 shots, 2 kills, both at half a mile. This time the reaction in the American trench was different. Sergeant Harding didn't stare in confusion. He scrambled over the rocks and positioned himself beside Tommy like a bodyguard. He barked orders at the other men to keep their heads down, to not draw fire to Tommy's position. He offered Tommy his canteen. He offered him a stick of gum. Suddenly, the college boy with the mail-order toy was the most valuable asset in the platoon. Harding pointed out targets. A machine gun nest dug into a cave mouth at 600 yards. A sniper hide in a breadfruit tree at 500. He was feeding the beast. Tommy went to work. For the next hour, he conducted a clinic in long-range destruction. He targeted the things the infantry couldn't touch. He put a round through the aperture of a bunker, killing the gunner inside. He shot the leg of a mortar tripod, toppling the weapon. He wasn't just killing men. He was dismantling their defensive network one piece at a time. The unearthal scope, with its absurd length and fragile mounts, was proving to be the perfect tool for the static grinding warfare of Peleliu. The high magnification allowed him to see into the shadows of the caves, to spot the muzzle flash of a hidden rifle, to pick out the camouflage netting that blended perfectly with the jungle. But the nature of the weapon began to show its flaws as the sun climbed higher. The heat was relentless. The steel barrel of the Springfield grew hot to the touch. Heat waves began to rise off the metal, shimmering right in front of the scope lens, distorting the image like a funhouse mirror. Tommy had to improvise. He took a strip of burlap from a sandbag and wrapped it loosely around the barrel to break up the heat waves. He used a piece of cardboard from a ration box to make a sunshade for the objective lens, taping it on with medical tape from his first aid pouch. He looked ridiculous. A dirty, sweating Marine holding a rifle covered in rags and cardboard. But it worked. The picture cleared up. The killing continued. The Japanese realized what was happening around noon. The random deaths weren't random. They were being picked apart by a single shooter, and they did what any disciplined army would do. They adapted. They stopped showing themselves. The ridge became a ghost town. No one stood up. No one looked through binoculars. They stayed deep in their caves and tunnels. The easy targets were gone. But Tommy was patient. His father had taught him patience in the woods of Michigan, waiting for deer that might never come. He could wait here too. He settled into a rhythm. Watch, calculate, breathe, wait. The world narrowed to the circle of glass in front of his eye. The voices of the other Marines faded into background noise. The explosions became distant thunder. There was only the math. Sergeant Harding sat beside him, chewing tobacco and watching the ridge through binoculars. After a long silence, he spoke. "Where'd you learn to shoot like this, Reeves?" Tommy didn't take his eye from the scope. "My father taught me. Michigan, white-tailed deer." "Your old man a Marine?" "He was. Guadalcanal, 1942. There was another silence. Harding spat into the coral. "He make it home." "No, Sergeant." Harding nodded slowly. He understood now. The rifle wasn't just a tool. It was a continuation. A promise kept. "He'd be proud of you, kid." Tommy said nothing, but his hands tightened slightly on the rifle. The weight of it felt heavier now, as if his father's ghost had settled into the wood and steel. The sun beat down on the Umobrogol pocket. The Marines huddled in their coral trenches, waiting for the next assault, the next mortar barrage, the next nightmare. But for the moment they had something they hadn't had before. They had distance. They had reach. They had the glass pipe. And the Japanese, for all their discipline and ferocity, had no answer for a man who could turn mathematics into death from half a mile away. Tommy adjusted the focus ring on the unearthal scope and continued his hunt. The toy rifle, the mail-order joke, the fragile glass tube that had no business in a war had just announced itself to the enemy. And the enemy was learning to be afraid. The morning of September 16th arrived with the same suffocating heat, but the battlefield had changed. Word had spread through the Marine lines like electricity through copper wire. There was a shooter in the Umobrogol pocket who could reach out and touch the enemy at distances that seemed impossible. The men who had laughed at Tommy Reeves 24 hours earlier now treated him like a priest carrying holy relics. But Tommy felt no different. He woke before dawn with the same knot in his stomach, the same tremor in his hands that only steadied when he wrapped his fingers around the rifle. He had killed 8 men the day before. 8 confirmed. Probably more that he couldn't verify. The numbers should have meant something, but they felt hollow. What mattered was that the mortars had stopped falling on his friends. Sergeant Harding appeared beside him in the grey pre-dawn light, carrying a canteen cup of coffee that looked like motor oil. "Battalion wants you to take a look at a bunker complex. Grid 447229. They think it's a command post." Tommy took the coffee and studied the map Harding spread across an ammunition crate. The bunker was 900 yards away, built into the reverse slope of a ridge that the Marines couldn't approach without walking into a meat grinder. 900 yards, Tommy said quietly, running the calculations in his head. "Bullet drop is about 230 inches. That's 19 feet. Harding stared at him. "You can hit something at 900 yards. "The manual says effective range is 900 yards for a point target. I've never tried it in combat." "Can you do it?" Tommy looked through the scope at the distant ridge. The bunker was barely visible, just a dark slash in the coral. But with the 8-power magnification, he could make out details. A gun port, the edge of a camouflage net, movement in the shadows. "Give me 40 minutes to calculate the shot." He set up on a different position, farther from where he'd fired the day before. The Japanese weren't stupid. They would be looking for him. Tommy built a hide using coral rocks and a piece of shelter, half creating a shadow that would hide his muzzle flash. He stacked sandbags to support the long rifle, making sure the unearthal's tube had clearance. Then he went to work with his notebook. 900 yards. Temperature already 95 degrees and rising. Humidity near saturation. Wind quartering from the southeast at maybe 7 miles per hour. He wrote the numbers on his forearm again, this time in smaller script because he was running out of clean skin. Harding watched him work, no longer questioning, just observing. You really do treat this like a math problem. It is a math problem, Sergeant. Gravity is a constant. Wind is a variable. Temperature affects air density. The math doesn't care if I'm scared. Are you scared? Tommy looked up from his calculations. Every single time. He settled behind the rifle and began the slow process of stalking a target he could barely see. Through the scope, the bunker entrance became clear. He could see the sandbags, the firing port, the glint of metal inside. He waited. For 30 minutes, nothing moved. The sun climbed higher. Sweat ran into Tommy's eyes. The coral dug into his elbows. Harding sat beside him, patient, chewing tobacco. Then a figure appeared in the bunker entrance. Just for a moment, an officer, judging by the uniform. He was shouting orders to someone inside, gesturing with a map case. Tommy had already dialed in the elevation. 28 clicks up. Wind correction 3 clicks right. He placed the crosshair on a point in empty space, approximately 18 feet above the officer's head. He was aiming at the sky. He exhaled half a breath. Everything outside the circle of glass ceased to exist. The officer was still visible, still shouting. Tommy squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared. The scope slid forward and back. Tommy worked the bolt without thinking, muscle memory taking over. He watched through the glass as the officer suddenly stumbled backward and disappeared into the bunker. 2 seconds later, the bunker erupted with activity. Men poured out, confused, leaderless. And then something Tommy hadn't expected. A white flag. A piece of cloth tied to a rifle barrel waving from the bunker entrance. Harding grabbed the radio. Actual, this is Harding. Enemy position grid 447229 is showing white flag. Repeat, white flag. The radio crackled back. Verify and hold position. Over the next 20 minutes, 47 Japanese soldiers emerged from that bunker complex with their hands up. 47 men who would have fought to the death, surrendering because their commander was gone. Killed by a bullet that dropped from the sky like a judgment from God. The Marine lieutenant who took the surrender walked back to Tommy's position an hour later. He was young, maybe 23, with the strained look of a man who had seen too much in too short a time. Corporal Reeves, the prisoners say their commander was killed by a sniper. They thought it was artillery at first because the angle was so steep. He paused. How far was that shot? 900 yards, sir. The lieutenant shook his head slowly. That's not possible. Tommy said nothing. The rifle, still resting on the sandbags with its ridiculous glass tube, spoke for itself. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A Marine Corps photographer arrived at Tommy's position with a battered speed graphic camera. Corporal Reeves, I'm supposed to document the specialized weapon systems. He looked at the Springfield with obvious confusion. Is this it? Harding laughed, a deep rumbling sound. That's it. The whole weapon system. 1 rifle, 1 calculator. The photographer set up his shot. Tommy posed reluctantly, the unearthly scope catching the harsh Pacific sunlight. The glass tube looked even more absurd in the stark contrast of black and white. Sir, can you look through the scope? For the picture. Tommy settled behind the rifle. Through the lens, he could see the ridge where the officer had fallen yesterday. Already Japanese engineers were rebuilding the positions. War didn't pause for photographs. The shutter clicked. The photographer made notes on a pad. This'll be in the division newsletter. Marine sniper with experimental optics. That okay? No names, Tommy said quietly. Just the rifle. Why not you're a hero, Corporal? Tommy looked past the photographer at the white crosses being pounded into the coral below the ridge. Each one marking a Marine who would never go home. Heroes are the ones who didn't make it back. I'm just doing math. The photographer left confused. Harding offered Tommy a canteen. You know they're going to write about you anyway, kid. Let them write about the rifle. The rifle can't read the letters from widows. But the kill had consequences Tommy didn't anticipate. That afternoon, a Marine interpreter questioned the prisoners and brought back disturbing news. The Japanese had a name for Tommy now. Akuma no Megane. The devil with glasses, and there was a reward, 1,000 yen for information leading to the sniper's position. Harding took the news badly. They're hunting you specifically now, kid. We need to move you around, different positions, never shoot from the same spot twice. I know, Sergeant. Do you? Because this isn't deer hunting anymore. They're going to come for you. As if to punctuate his words, the afternoon brought a new sound. A deep rhythmic thumping that made the ground vibrate. Harding's face went pale. Get down, now! Before Tommy could move, the ridge above them erupted with heavy machine gun fire. But this wasn't the sustained bursts of a standard weapon. This was something heavier. A Type 92 heavy machine gun firing 7.7mm rounds from a concealed position somewhere on the second ridgeline. The rounds walked across the valley like a giant's footsteps. Each impact threw up geysers of pulverized coral. They were walking the fire directly toward Tommy's last known position, trying to kill him with suppression and volume. Tommy and Harding pressed themselves into the bottom of the trench as the world exploded around them. Razor-sharp splinters of coral whistled overhead. The concussion from each impact felt like being punched in the chest. When the firing stopped, Tommy's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear Harding shouting at him. "We have to move! They have the spot dialed in!" But Tommy had seen something in those few seconds of terror. The muzzle flash, a dark slash in the jungle canopy on the far ridge. The heavy gun crew had revealed themselves. He crawled back to his rifle and checked it frantically. The scope was covered in dust, but the glass was intact. The mounts were still tight. He blew the dust off the lenses and looked toward the second ridgeline. "Reeves, what are you doing?" "We need to move." "That gun is at least 1,000 yards out, Sergeant." "Maybe 1,100. Exactly, it's out of range. Let's go." Tommy settled the rifle back onto the sandbags. His hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From something else, a kind of cold certainty. "The manual says effective range is 900 yards, but the bullet doesn't know that." Harding stared at him. "You're not serious." "They just tried to kill us. I know where they are now." "Tommy." It was the first time Harding had used his first name. "That's a suicide shot. The bullet will drop 30 feet. You'll be aiming at clouds." "I know." Tommy looked through the scope and found the dark slash in the jungle. He could see the glint of metal where the heavy gun was hiding. The problem was elevation. Even with maximum adjustment, the scope couldn't compensate for a 1,000-yard shot. He would have to use Kentucky windage, holding the crosshair high above the target and guessing the drop. He aimed at a patch of blue sky approximately 20 feet above the gun position. He was aiming at nothing. He was aiming at air, at faith, at the same kind of mathematics his father had trusted when he'd aimed at Germans in a different war on a different continent. He exhaled. He trusted the math. He trusted the glass pipe that everyone said was a toy. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. The scope slid. Tommy pulled it back and kept his eye on the distant jungle, but the recoil had knocked his sight picture too high. By the time he got the scope back down, the event was over. He just saw the canopy. He waited for the return fire. Waited for the heavy gun to tear his position apart. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5, 10. Silence. The rhythmic thumping of the Japanese heavy gun did not return. A cheer erupted from PFC Johnson, who had been spotting with binoculars. Harding was pounding Tommy on the back, shouting that he'd seen the gun crew scramble, that he'd seen the gunner slump over the receiver. The round had dropped out of the sky at a steep angle, plunging into the open machine gun nest like a mortar shell. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. It was luck. But in war, luck counts just as much as skill. Tommy didn't celebrate. He slumped back against the trench wall, breath coming in ragged gasps. The unearthed scope was covered in soot. He wiped the lenses with numb fingers, checking for cracks he knew would end everything. None. The glass remained perfect. The toy had survived another test. But the silence was a trap. Tommy had been operating from positions in the same general area for nearly 2 hours. He had fired more than 20 rounds. He had killed officers, gunners, and dismantled defensive positions. He had become the biggest problem on the battlefield. And on Peleliu, when you became a problem, the Japanese didn't just send more infantry, they sent armor. The ground shook with a different vibration this time. Not explosions. Something mechanical. A low grinding noise that rattled teeth and turned stomachs. Harding's face went white. "Tanks!" someone screamed. "Type 95, 2 of them!" Tommy shifted position, dragging the heavy rifle across the sandbags to look down into the valley. 2 Japanese light tanks were clanking around the bend of the ridge road. They were ugly, boxy machines painted in yellow and brown camouflage. Small compared to American Shermans, but against infantry with no anti-tank weapons, they were unstoppable. Their 37mm main guns swiveled searching. Their hull-mounted machine guns sprayed the American lines with reckless hatred. The infantry opened up with everything they had. Garons pinged harmlessly off steel armor. Grenades exploded uselessly against the tracks. The tanks ignored the small arms fire. They were rolling straight toward the gap in the lines, intent on overrunning the command post. Tommy felt ice in his stomach. His rifle was useless here. A .30 caliber bullet against tank armor was like throwing pebbles at a locomotive. He could maybe hit the driver's vision slit, but that was a tiny rectangle of thick glass, barely 2 inches wide, and the tank was moving. Harding was screaming for a bazooka team, but the bazookas were gone. out of ammunition or destroyed or buried with their operators in the coral. Tommy watched the lead tank. It wasn't buttoned up. The commander's hatch was open. A Japanese officer stood in the turret, exposed from the chest up, shouting into a headset. It was the same arrogance the officer on the ridge had shown yesterday. They believed the American infantry was suppressed, broken. They didn't think anyone was crazy enough to take a shot at a tank with a bolt-action rifle. Tommy centered the crosshair on the tank commander. The problem was movement. The tank was bouncing over uneven ground, lurching violently. The commander bobbed up and down like a cork in rough water. Every time Tommy tried to track him, the narrow field of view of the scope lost the target. He did something that made Harding gasp. He reached up and adjusted the magnification ring on the unearthal, dialing it down. The image got smaller, but the field of view widened. Now he could see the whole tank. He could see the rhythm of the bounce. Up, down, the suspension compressing and rebounding. He had to time the shot, fire at the top of the bounce, that split second where the suspension hung in the air before crashing back down. Tommy led the tank, placed the vertical crosshair 2 feet in front of the commander's face, waited for the tank to climb over a pile of rubble. The nose pitched up. The commander rose into the crosshair. Tommy fired. The bullet struck this commander in the side of the helmet. The man disappeared into the turret as if yanked by an invisible cable. The tank swerved violently, left crashing into a limestone wall. The engine sputtered and died. It sat there smoking, disabled. The second tank didn't stop. It roared past its crippled partner, accelerating toward the Marine lines. This one's hatch was closed. No commander to shoot. It was buttoned up tight, a rolling steel coffin. 400 yards and closing fast. Tommy scanned desperately. The armor was impenetrable. The tracks were moving too fast. Then he saw it. The gunner's optic. A small glass circle next to the main gun barrel, maybe the size of a teacup saucer. If he could shatter that glass, the gunner would be blind. The tank was 300 yards away. The main gun fired. The shell exploded against the trench wall 10 feet from Tommy, showering him with dirt and hot shrapnel. Blood trickled from his nose from the concussion. He wiped it away and settled back behind the rifle. He placed the crosshair on the tiny glass eye and squeezed. The shot sparked off the turret armor. A miss by inches. Tommy worked the bolt frantically. The tank was 200 yards away now. Machine gun rounds chewed up the sandbags. Harding was firing his Thompson in a useless gesture of defiance. Tommy fired again. This time white dust puffed exactly on the optic. Glass shattered. The turret stopped turning. The main gun froze, pointing uselessly to the right. Without the gun, the tank was just a battering ram. The Marines swarmed it, jamming grenades into vision slits, throwing a satchel charge onto the engine deck. The explosion rocked the valley. The second tank ground to a halt, burning. Tommy slumped against the trench wall. His whole body trembled, adrenaline draining away and leaving nothing but exhaustion. The unearthal scope was covered in soot, but the glass remained unbroken. He checked the mounts. Still tight. Still true. The fragile glass pipe had just killed 2 tanks. The impossible had become routine. But the day wasn't over. The destruction of the tanks enraged the Japanese defenders in a way that rifle fire never could. Tommy had crossed an invisible line. He had moved from nuisance to genuine threat, from sniper to something the enemy didn't have a tactical answer for. And when an army has no tactical answer, it resorts to the oldest solution in warfare: overwhelming force. The attack began with a sound that turned blood to ice water. Tenno Heika Banzai. The cry rose from the jungle floor like the voice of 1,000 demons. It started as a whisper, then grew to a roar that echoed off the coral ridges. 10,000 Banzai. Long live the Emperor. Harding's face went pale. He'd heard this sound before on other islands, and he knew what it meant. Banzai charge, fix bayonets. The Marines locked their long steel blades onto the ends of their garons. They braced themselves against the trench walls. They knew what was coming. Hand-to-hand combat. Brutal, intimate, and bloody. Tommy looked down at his Springfield. It had a bayonet lug, but the thought of mounting a blade on a rifle with a 2-foot precision scope was insane. The vibration of stabbing someone would shatter the optics. The rifle was too long, too heavy, too fragile for what was about to happen. He made a decision that felt like cutting off his own arm. Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wrench he carried for the scope mounts. With trembling fingers, he loosened the thumb screws. He slid the unearthal scope off the rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. 24 inches of glass and steel that had kept him alive for 2 days. He didn't just toss it aside. He wrapped it in the canvas case with the same care a mother might wrap a newborn baby. Then he shoved it deep under the heavy sandbags at the bottom of the trench, burying it like treasure. Harding watched him, understanding. "You're going to be okay without it." Tommy stood up. He was just a rifleman now, a bolt-action rifle with iron sights and 5 rounds in the magazine. He looked at Harding and nodded. My father fought without glass. I can too. The first Japanese soldiers hit the wire at a dead run. The machine guns tore them apart, but more came behind, climbing over the bodies. They were 50 yards away, then 30, then 10. Tommy fired his iron-sighted rifle as fast as he could work the bolt. He dropped a man at 20 yards, another at 10. The muzzle flash burned his eyes. The rifle cracked against his shoulder again and again. Then the wave crashed into the trench. A Japanese soldier vaulted over the parapet and landed directly on top of Tommy. The impact drove the air from his lungs. The soldier raised his rifle to drive the bayonet down. Tommy brought the stock of the Springfield up with desperate strength, smashing it into the man's jaw. The wood cracked. The soldier fell backward. Tommy scrambled to his feet, working the bolt. He fired from the hip, the muzzle blast singing the soldier's uniform at point-blank range. The trench became a slaughterhouse. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing, gouging, screaming. There was no strategy here. No windage adjustments. No mathematics. Just the oldest equation of all. Kill or be killed. Tommy fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. He used the rifle as a club when there was no time to reload. He used his trench knife, a 6-inch blade that his father had carried in the First World War. He fought until his arms felt like lead and his lungs burned with each breath. Harding stayed close, the big sergeant fighting like a demon, keeping the enemy away from Tommy's blind spots. They fought back-to-back, 2 men against a tide of violence. And then as suddenly as it started, the wave broke. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated back into the smoke and jungle. The trench was filled with the dead and dying. The living sat in shocked silence, covered in blood and coral dust. Tommy collapsed onto an ammo crate, gasping. His knuckles were split. His rifle stock was gouged and battered. He looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking uncontrollably. Then he remembered. The scope! He dropped to his knees and began digging through the sandbags with frantic hands. Harding helped him, both men throwing aside the heavy bags until they found the canvas case. Tommy unwrapped it as if it were made of butterfly wings. The unearthed scope was there. Clean. Safe. Perfect. He held it up to the fading light. The glass was clear. The spider silk crosshair was intact. Relief washed over him so powerfully that his eyes stung. Harding sat down heavily beside him, a fresh bandage wrapped around his head, blood soaking through. "You keep that thing safe, kid. We got a lot of work to do tomorrow." Tommy nodded. He carefully remounted the scope on the battered rifle, tightening the screws with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He checked the alignment. Still zeroed. The sun began to set over the Pacific, turning the sky blood red. Somewhere in the darkening ridges, the enemy was regrouping, planning. But they would be more cautious now. They knew about the devil with glasses. The battle for Peleliu wasn't over. It wouldn't be over for another 6 weeks. The 1st Marine Division would be chewed up and spit out by the Omobrogol pocket. Regiments that landed with 3,000 men would leave with fewer than 1,000. But through those weeks of grinding attrition, something changed in how the Marines fought. Tommy Reeves became the hand of God. When a patrol was pinned by a hidden machine gun, they didn't wait for artillery that might never come. They called for the man with the long rifle. Tommy would appear, set up his impossible weapon with its fragile glass tube, and the problem would disappear. Sometimes it took 1 shot. Sometimes it took 20. But the problems got solved. He stopped counting kills after the 1st week. The numbers felt obscene. What mattered was that his calculations saved lives. For every trigger pull, there were Marines who made it another 10 yards without dying. By late October, when the 1st Division was finally pulled off the line, Tommy looked like a ghost. He'd lost 23 pounds. His eyes were sunken. His hands shook constantly except when they held the rifle. The unearthed scope was battered and scarred. The black finish was worn off the knobs. The aluminum mounts were scratched and dented. But the glass remained perfect. Tommy had protected that optic more carefully than his own body. When the armorer took the rifle for processing, it felt like an amputation. "Serial number 3928471, the armorer said, making notes on a clipboard. "This one's got a history now." Tommy nodded, unable to speak. He walked away with empty hands, feeling lighter, but also feeling naked. Harding found him on the transport ship, staring at the island as it disappeared behind them. "You gonna be okay, calculator?" Tommy didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "What do I do now, Sarge? I only know how to calculate death." Harding lit 2 cigarettes and handed one to Tommy. "You'll figure it out. You're the smartest guy I ever met. And Tommy..." He paused. "Your old man would be proud." Tommy returned to Michigan in December of 1944. There was a parade. The mayor made a speech. They hung a banner across Main Street that said, "Welcome home, hero." Tommy stood in his dress blues with the silver star on his chest and hated every second of it. Someone asked him to describe killing Japanese soldiers. He excused himself and walked to his father's grave alone. The headstone was simple granite, George Reeves, 1898 to 1942, Guadalcanal. Tommy knelt in the snow and placed his silver star on the frozen ground. "I've finished the math, Dad. I used the glass just like you said I could." His voice cracked. "But I don't think I can calculate anymore. The numbers have faces now." He tried to return to normal life, enrolled at the University of Michigan to study mathematics, sat in classrooms where professors praised his genius, but he couldn't sit still. Too many windows, too many angles. His mind automatically calculated range and windage for targets that didn't exist. He lasted one semester before he quit and took a job at the lumber mill where his father had worked, cutting timber, operating saws, manual labor that silenced the nightmares at least during the day. He married Sarah Donovan in the spring of 1946. She was patient and kind and never asked questions when he woke up screaming. On their wedding night, he cried and couldn't explain why. She held him and said, "You're home now. That's all that matters." Life moved forward the way it does. Children came, 2 boys and 2 girls. Tommy taught them mathematics at the kitchen table but never took them hunting. When they asked why, he just said he'd done enough shooting for one lifetime. The years passed. Korea came and went. Vietnam. Tommy watched the news and saw young men with scoped rifles doing the same work he'd done. The technology improved. The optics got better. But the math stayed the same. Then in June of 1952, Marines in dress uniforms appeared at his door. "Corporal Reeves, the Marine Corps needs you to train scout snipers. 3 weeks at Quantico. Not to fight, just to teach." Tommy, now 26 but looking 40, shook his head. "I don't shoot anymore." "We don't need you to shoot, sir. We need you to teach them to think." After the Marines left, Sarah found him sitting on the porch. "You should go," she said quietly. "I can't hold a rifle again. I can't." "Then don't hold a rifle. Hold a chalkboard." At Quantico, Tommy taught 40 young Marines the mathematics of long-range shooting. He never touched a weapon, just chalk and blackboard, filling it with equations for bullet drop, wind drift, temperature effects. The young Marines at Quantico were different from the men Tommy had fought beside. They were peacetime volunteers turned wartime necessities. They had fresh uniforms and full ration cards. They hadn't yet learned to sleep through artillery. Tommy stood at the chalkboard, filling it with equations they didn't understand. Bullet drop at 800 yards in 70-degree temperature with 30% humidity and a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind. He wrote the formula. "Who can solve this? Silence." "Nobody. This is high school trigonometry." A young corporal raised his hand. "Sir, we're Marines. We shoot, we don't calculate." Tommy set down the chalk. He rolled up his sleeve, showing the faded pencil marks that would never fully wash away. "I was a Marine too. I shot, but I calculated first." He pointed at the equation. "Every one of these numbers is a man who went home to his family. Every missed calculation is a Marine who didn't." The classroom went quiet. "You think shooting is about courage? It's not. Courage is what happens after you do the math and realize how bad the odds are, and you take the shot anyway." He picked up the chalk again. "Now, someone solve this equation or I'm keeping you here until you do." They learned. Slowly, grudgingly, but they learned. One young Marine struggled, couldn't hit past 600 yards. "Sir, I'm not good enough." Tommy looked at him, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not a happy smile, a knowing one. "You think I was good? I was terrified. Every single shot." He rolled up his sleeve again, showed the marks. "But I did the math, and math doesn't care if you're scared." Letters came from Korea that winter. Trainees writing to thank him. One letter said, "I made a 920-yard shot today. Used your formula. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the rifle, but the math didn't shake. Thank you for teaching me that fear and accuracy can coexist." Tommy read that letter to Sarah and understood something he hadn't before. He'd given those young men his father's gift. Not just the mathematics, the permission to be afraid and still do the job. The years rolled on. Tommy worked the lumber mill until retirement, raised his children, refused every interview about the war. To his neighbors, he was just the quiet guy who could fix anything with a wrench. In 1995, he took his grandson Michael deer hunting. The boy was 20. Tommy was 71. "Grandpa, you never shoot, you just watch." Tommy smiled. "I calculated enough killing for one lifetime. Now I just observe." Michael made a clean shot at 300 yards. Tommy watched the deer drop and felt his father's presence like a hand on his shoulder. "Good math," he said quietly. "Your great-grandfather would be proud." Tommy Reeves died on June 12, 1998. Heart failure, peaceful, 74 years old. Sarah was holding his hand when he went. In his final moments, he whispered numbers she didn't understand. Elevation, windage, the same calculations he'd written on his arm 54 years before. Then he smiled and said something she almost missed. "I see you, Dad. The math was right." His family found a locked footlocker in the basement. Inside was the silver star he'd never worn, a notebook filled with ballistics calculations, letters from Korean War snipers thanking him, a photograph of him and Harding on Peleliu standing by the rifle, and a note in his handwriting, "The rifle is in the museum. Serial 3928471. It wasn't mine, it belonged to the math. The math belonged to my father. I was just the one who remembered to carry the one." Today in the National Museum of the Marine Corps, there's a display case in a quiet corner. Inside sits a 1903 Springfield with serial number 3928471. Mounted on top is an unearthly 8-power scope, impossibly long, still pristine after 80 years. Most visitors walk past it. They want tanks and flamethrowers. They see the skinny rifle and think it looks like something for shooting tin cans. They don't know the story. They don't know that this fragile glass pipe held the line when armor rolled and mortars fell. They don't know about the 20-year-old kid from Michigan who turned mathematics into salvation for the men beside him. But sometimes a young Marine stops, reads the placard, studies the scope. An older Marine working as a guard notices, "You know what minute of angle means, son?" "Yes, sir." Reeves could hold .5 MOA in 115-degree heat with people trying to kill him in 1944. With that. The young Marine stares at the rifle with new respect. The guard continues, voice softer now. "He didn't shoot to kill. He shot so someone else could live. That's the only calculation that ever mattered." The museum closes. The lights dim. The rifle sits in its case, waiting. The glass pipe, the mail-order toy, the hand of God. Silent now. But the math remains. The math always remains. And somewhere in the eternal arithmetic of courage and sacrifice, Tommy Reeves still carries the one.